right, standard announcements this week. Just another Money's Point this weekend. Two-person team elections, so that's due this Saturday. So those keep trickling in, and when they trickle in, I'll try to add people to the Canvas groups and update the grades. So make sure both people in the teams submit that so that I can confirm that both are in agreement on their team. And then a week after that, you'll submit, and this is looking for like a sentence, like, so if it's in the list of suggester candidate algorithms, you just have to say, we're going to study the artificial bee colony optimization or MOEAD or whatever's in the list, and that's fine. If you found one that isn't in the list that you think is relevant to nature-inspired AI or optimization, then just suggest it and give me a couple sentence justification, and I'll review that and then be able to say, yep, looks good or not. And then the other thing, mini project 3 and concept check 4 are due this Sunday. So mini project from unit 3 and the concept check from this past unit that we're kind of concluding up here. And that's it. So same announcements as Tuesday. Any questions about timelines moving forward? All right, so today we're wrapping up unit 4. So where we've been focusing on evolution as a motivating, driving, inspirational force in the design of these algorithms, which sort of look for creative ways to search spaces. And we're transitioning then from evolution to physics. And in a lot of, well, we'll see, especially in this unit, that although things might have started in nature-inspired, a lot of the things that came out of nature-inspired have found their way into other algorithms that or other approaches, especially in machine learning, that you've seen today. So part of the reason why I put these things together is actually even in downstream units like the Swarm Intelligence unit, which will be our unit after Unit 5, then we'll see that although those take a different inspiration, we start looking at the behaviors of individual organisms, aspects of them you'll see were themselves inspired by phenomena that were observed in these two camps. So we're gradually gaining familiarity with the vocabulary of sort of nature-inspired mechanisms, and we'll see that evolution really contributes thinking about, one set of things, physics really contributes thinking about another set of things, and so on. And a lot of new nature-inspired algorithms are really just reshuffling old ones, because I think a lot of what we have through, say, evolution, physics, and particles, or in swarms, those three things together, I think, contribute most of the core principles that we see reshuffled in other algorithms. And then they've then trickled out of nature-inspired into more mainstream algorithms as well. All right, so that's the map going forward. Let's wrap up here where we were at the end of Unit 4, where the last thing I'm going to talk about is these distributed GAs and parallel GAs. And so I mentioned that a distributed genetic algorithm is just you take a genetic algorithm that you would normally distribute across, or you normally implement in individuals, like 100 individuals. And instead of putting that in one big monolithic GA, you split it up into groups, deans, as the term from biology, that are these closely related individuals, typically breeding within the group. So you just divide one big GA into multiple small GAs. And usually you just initialize them with genotypes that are kind of nearby, so they're closely related. So instead of drawing randomly 100 genotypes from the entire decision space, you might draw 25 from over here, 25 from over here, 25 from over here, and 25 from over here. And then you let them run their own independent GAs. Yes, you can parallelize this. You can put this on parallel hardware if you want, but that's not the point exactly here. We're going to get to sort of like one of the different ways you could parallelize GAs here in a bit, but even on a sequential processor, you could do this. So it still could be that you're iterating through 100 individuals. It just happens to be that when you go through these 25, you treat them as one GA, and then you go to these 25 as another GA, and so on and so forth. So that in your one generation, you're actually just running an algorithm, it's like you're running 4 GA generations in sequence and then restarting them. So it's not about the parallelization, it is about the population structure. And so you usually run those, and then periodically, so maybe every, and you can define this rate, every 100 generations or so, you then run a migration operator. So this is the 4th force of evolution that we're now directly using here. And this migration, you have to set up a migration policy, and that would say something like, all right, so I'm going to choose 2 deems, and I am going to take the top individual from one deem and swap it with the lowest ranking individual, not necessarily swap, but I'm going to copy it to the lowest ranking individual of another deem. So every 100 generations, I look at these and I say, oh, the top ranking individual here, they have higher fitness than the lowest ranking individual here. So I'm going to kill the lowest ranking individual here and replace it with a copy of this individual, as if this individual has now sent off an offspring that dispersed and rejoined, and joined this new population. So that has to happen relatively rarely. If it happens too often, then you just now basically run one giant GA. Because if you've done this population structuring, and every generation you're doing this migration process, then although it looks like you've got 4 GAs, what you're really doing is one big GA, and you're just paying the overhead of additional bookkeeping to cut them into these groups here. So the question is, if we can keep them isolated for long periods of time, then does the group end up doing a better job searching the space than a large, so if we had no population structure, if it was just 100 individuals all together in one big bubble, how does that compare to this population structuring? So we really want to maintain the population structure. That's the thought here. And we'll see why this works, when it works, and so on in just a second. So overall, what we're looking for here are so-called meta-population dynamics. So far we've had populations of individuals. Now we're borrowing from ecology, and we're talking about meta-populations, populations of populations. So when you have an enforced population structure, so you can think of this as like these are islands, and these islands are so geographically separated that it is rare but possible for individuals to get from one island to another. So these could be little insects that can occasionally be carried in the wind from one island to another. And so that doesn't happen very often. It happens far less than interactions within the island, but it does happen. So if you create these population structures, these islands, and so sometimes these are called island model GAs, then how does it change the dynamics? And that fits within this realm of meta populations, where now we're sort of thinking about okay, so let's say, is there a genotype that starts to dominate this group? Was there another genotype that dominates this group? Is there another genotype that dominates this group? Is there another genotype that dominates this group? And so now we can sort of start thinking about, okay, what happens to the dominant genotype across the metapopulation structure? So we can start thinking of these little islands, almost as individuals in a bigger population. And so we're sort of seeing, what does the turnover look like across the islands? Before we're interested in what does the turnover look like across individuals. So we start out with a huge diversity of individuals, and due to drift or selection, then gradually a certain subset of individuals start producing more and more offspring, and they start taking over the population. And so the question here is, if we associate each one of these with a genotype that seems to take over their relative populations, then across the population of populations, do we start seeing, because of migration, that maybe we do start seeing some spreading of these? So how do the dynamics change across this higher level structure? That's the idea behind these island models. Okay. So that's the motivation, and you should have a lot of questions as to why would you ever want to do this? Why would you even think this would be a good idea? Because most of the time it's not a good idea. Most of the time you do this, you get a lot of extra work keeping track of all these islands, And it doesn't end up making things any better. So for most problems, you're paying extra overhead for all the partitions. Each subpopulation is smaller. So remember, small populations in GAs generally are not good. Small populations, that gives you less resolution, a higher drift barrier. So you generally are going to be poor searchers, and you're going to be more prone to just drifting to a random phenotype when things get within that resolution limit. So you sort of amplify drift, or you reduce the ability of selection to fine tune. And then on top of that, each subpopulation has less coverage. And so even though you are spreading things out in the whole metapopulation across the decision space, each individual little cluster is, it's because of this population structure, they tend to just focus on a particular area. So for most problems, like if you just have a relatively smooth optimization objective, you just don't know where that maximum peak is, but it's got some pretty well-behaved dynamics, then this approach it's probably going to find that peak, but it might take longer to find that peak, and it may not get to the tip top of that peak. So doesn't seem like it's a good thing. May as well just take, instead of 4 populations of 25, 1 population of 100. But the thought is, excuse me, the thought is that there might be a particular set of problems that are the kind of niche for this island model GA. And so, so although these GAs do not work well on easy problems, then empirically, it seems like they do a little bit better job with really hard problems. So what I mean by hard problems, local optima are numerous. And so imagine a multivariate, multimodal objective function, so very big decision space going in all the directions, lots of peaks, lots of troughs, very rugged landscape. And so they tend to do a better job at finding the global maximizer. They aren't tripped up when basins of attraction are narrow. So what I mean by that is if you have an optimization objective that has a really narrow fitness peak, then this really narrow fitness peak, it might be missed it might be missed by another algorithm, but then also the troughs next to it, they might end up creating, there might be traps where, I'm trying to think, like if you have a tiny fitness peak and then you'd like to find this big fitness peak, but so like you've got these really narrow fitness peaks. Well, they've got such high selective pressure on the left and the right of this peak over here that you might get trapped at the top of this peak because it's so steep. It's so scary for this population to then stick its toe out over here because the fitness drops so much. And so these narrow peaks will often trap a lot of other algorithms that seem to not create the same traps for these distributed GAs. And then also when your global optima are not easy to distinguish from your local. So if you have a lot of local optima, but so this is the global optima, this local is pretty close, this is pretty close as well, then you want to say, well, how often do I actually get that global? And it tends to be that for these DGAs, they do a little bit better at this, and if you rerun them over and over again, they tend to give you the same answer. So they're a little bit more robust. So a normal GA for these complex landscapes, you run them, it might give you an okay answer, but then if you rerun the GA with a new set of initial conditions, you get a different peak. So it doesn't have that robustness. It's sort of, you never quite know what you get. But the DGAs, they seem to have a little bit more robustness there. So then the question is, why? So we just because you see this anecdotally, we want to sort of say, what is some sort of theoretical reason to try to explain why these DGAs might be working a little bit better? And initially, people from the metacrostics community looked to population genetics because it turns out that there are island population dynamics in real life. There, I mentioned the insects that get carried by the wind, so, and those things we know have a lot of potential to affect population dynamics. And so one of the early models of this was by something called Sewall Wright and a so-called shifting balance theory, SBT. I guess I'll write SBT, so it's a frequent abbreviation. And so this was coined, or this sometimes is called small experiments in evolution. So the idea here is that let's think about the population genetic effects of these small populations. Well, because they're small, then we're going to think that it does reduce the sensitivity to selection and it increases the influence of drift. So I said it was a bad thing before, but this balance here, so the balance that we're going to refer to is the balance of all four forces of evolution. And so Wright was suggesting that there might be conditions if you have multiple islands that because drift is amplified in those islands, but there are multiple islands, the diversity in drift outcomes across the islands could be a resource. So on a single small population, drift is just random noise. It's a scary thing. But if you have enough of them, then maybe it is something you can mine. Maybe it's something that can be a resource. And that's what we're going to see here. So each island has got more drift. And so that's going to change the balance of the forces of evolution. So initially, the first three forces of evolution without migration in that one dean. So the deans come into a balance of selection, drift, and mutation that is going to have either high fitness diversity if mutation happens to also be high, or multiple deans drifting to different effectively neutral candidates, even if low mutation, and even if those deans, so I can have an island over here and miles away, an island over there, they might be exploring the same fitness peak. So they're co-located in the fitness landscape, even though they're geographically separated. And if they both have a small population, they might get into a neutral window where drift takes over. This one might drift to one genotype. This one might drift to another genotype. So they're co-located in fitness space, but the geographic separation prevents them from intermixing. So they drift to different candidates. Yes?
That sounds like the lower resolution is almost good because it kind of has an even fitness frontier.
That's the theory, yes, is that you, by giving a little bit of slack, normally you don't want that slack because it doesn't allow you to fine tune. But if you have multiple copies, then maybe that slack allows the multiple copies to create a new ensemble that you can use. We'll see pictures of this here in a second. All right, so this turns drift into a new source of variation, in theory. These lower fitness, so that's one thing that happens here. Now, remember, lower fitness candidates, because selections has been masked out by drift, selection's got this chunky resolution because there's few individuals. The effective population size is smaller, so selection can't fine tune. So there is a larger window in which low fitness candidates, if they're not that low, selection doesn't even see them. They can survive, they can hide. So these low fitness candidates, protected from selection, can, if this is a relatively, and we'll see a picture of this and then even an animation in just a second, but if we have a fitness peak that's pretty low, if the effective population size, the population size is small, then you get this sort of drift barrier that sets up this huge neutral window, which that's going to allow for, I mean, anybody in this neutral window, there will be no selection against them. Selection can't see differences at a resolution smaller than this. And that's going to mean that there's going to be a probability that you'll get individuals that are out here in this adaptive valley. And as, again, I'll see this in a much cleaner drawing here in a second. But if you can manage to get an individual to pop out on the other side of this valley, then selection can take it up this other peak. That's the idea here, is that potentially this effect can lead the reduction in the selectivity of selection allows for tunneling through or crossing adaptive valleys, because normally those adaptive valleys, normally selection would not allow for downward motion. But if you can manage to just randomly populate enough, then you sort of get, if you can be lucky enough to get on this side of the valley, then selection will be your friend and help you explore a new area. That's what Wright was kind of thinking here. And then if you, on your little geographic island, have discovered a new fitness peak, and that new fitness peak generates lots of offspring because you now dominate your little geographic island, then all of those offspring, there's a chance that some of them are going to migrate to another geographic area and bring that innovation with them. So this is the small experiments in evolution idea. We're going to leave these we're going to sort of set up a lab over there. We're going to set up a lab over there. We're going to say, you guys work on a problem. You guys work on the same problem. I don't want you to talk to each other, but we'll come together and compare our notes in a year. And so they end up finding some interesting solutions. They end up finding some interesting solutions. Maybe they find the same solutions, but maybe they're different. So in a year, they come back into a conference, they chat with each other, and then suddenly you find out that their solution's pretty good, their solution's totally different, but a little better. Even though their solution is good relative to everything they've seen, they never even explored the things that they did, and then so now they take those. That's the kind of migration idea. If you think this is a general principle, then this might suggest that, that even in academic spheres, like once upon a time before the internet, the only way you shared that your lab discovered something new and exciting was if you went to the annual conference. And so between the annual conferences, you weren't necessarily calling someone up to say, hey, we just found this new algorithm or whatever. You had to wait until that conference in order to spread that information. And if you buy that there's something interesting going on here, then there might be a universe where that environment of sparse connection between labs might actually lead to more innovation than one where you're constantly connected. Because the thought here is that if you have constant migration, everybody's just going to be following the latest trend, and you're not ever going to get anybody to spread out. The geographic separation allows them to do independent experiments, potentially in very different genotypes. And so they don't just follow trends. That's the thought here. Okay, so then, so in practical problems, in order to make this work, it's a Goldilocks situation. You have to have just the right amount of migration, just the right amount, just the right population size, just the right distribution. Like you can cook up a simulation where this will do a better job at finding peaks than a monolithic GA, but it's got to be just the perfect situation. So in evolutionary theory, although this was, sometimes we call these intuition pumps. What I love about shifting balance theory, when I talk about the four forces of evolution, is it helps us think about how the four forces of evolution can interact and how they, how subsets of them can come into balance and put tension on each other. And that's what I think was great. And Sewall Wright was he was one of the earliest kind of population geneticists, and this really shows the thinking about everything that could go on in a population. But this particular perfect storm of how all four of them come together is a perfect storm. So this has not been that influential in biology. But initially, people thought this might be what's going on in these distributed GAs, helping to explain their success. Okay, so before I ask for questions on that, so here's kind of a graphical representation of what I just said there. So imagine you have, and then I'll show a little animation of this, but imagine that this fitness landscape is shared all over the planet. You know, this is just what it means to be fit in this particular organism. And in this case, I've drawn two demes, and it happens to be that one deme started on this low peak and another deme started on this low peak. Because both demes have a small population size, then selection can't see anything smaller than this fitness difference. So if you happen to be in a window of this width, then you're effectively neutral relative to anyone else that's in that window. And so that means that you get a diverse population potentially maintained here until drift potentially converges on one of them. But while it's diverse enough, there's at least some probability that that selection will produce a small number that are outside that window that may end up in this armpit here, this adaptive valley. And if you can get one that shows up on the other side of this kind of unstable equilibrium at the bottom of the valley, then when selection comes around, it'll see these, and it will start to then populate these up this way until you can get a new population established up here that'll kill off all of these, and then now your deme will be up here. And the same thing can happen on this one, so you end up stabilizing a new population up here, and then when migration happens, then this deme will pull these ones over so that they all end up over here. That's the kind of a graphical insight here behind that. So if there's a little link here, I don't know if you can read that, but it's just links on asu.edu/SVT. So it's a little widget that I built just to illustrate that. So same sort of idea. You've got, if you've got these four peaks, unfortunately I didn't make them look like four peaks, which would have been nice, but four peaks and four demes. So I've got two demes on one peak. So they're geographically separated, but they happen to just be exploring the same spot in this fitness landscape. Another two demes on another peak. If we had selection only acting, so there wasn't any of these other forces going on, then they would just collapse here and stay there forever. But if we had drift to that, then what we end up seeing here is they spread out because selection can't fine tune anymore. And so these demes over here, A and B, these orange ones, well, they end up, these ones here, this orange here for deme D, the kind of orange red, and this light orange for deme B, and these blue ones, these ones here are pretty close in fitness to the original ones on the deme that they started in. So they're permitted to exist because they're either in that fitness window that due to the small population size, selection can't see any narrower than that, or they're just outside it, and so the selection operator still allows them some representation. But they happen to find themselves on very different peaks. So when selection kicks in, then you get a convergence. These new ones then move to their new peaks, and this sets up a shift. So there's going to be a new balance, because now we have these on a very different peak here. And so when then if you get migration, so back here, these selections before migration, these ones are going to kill these other ones here. They're going to dominate these. These are going to go away locally. So everybody's going to be up on these peaks. But then when you have migration happen, then you can end up getting even more convergence onto these peaks. I guess I could have actually had migration and bring them up onto a single peak, as opposed to, and this is the way I've kind of drawn this, I might redo this, but is I've sort of made it look like they're migrating This is sort of saying that like A and B are migrating between each other. It's just not really depicted that well here. But the thought here is that even if only A found this peak, a migration to B will also bring B to this peak. Even if only C finds this peak, a migration to D will also bring D to this peak. And this process can go on and on. And so it allows you to kind of slow down the search over the space so that you can find new global maxima and then eventually bring everyone there. But it's much slower, which allows for kind of a better accuracy and the speed accuracy trade-off. All right, so that's shifting balance theory. Any questions about that idea? Yeah.
There is an underlying assumption that you're able to spread your population, initial populations across the space.
Yes. And so like, that happens a little more, I don't want to say it happens a little unnaturally. And so in biology, there are pressures that could cause things to spread out and then radiate, so they become different from each other. But there's also bottleneck effects. And so, that is one of the things is that in all GAs, you need an initial source of entropy. You need an initial source of deviation of diversity in order to make them work. This is a different way of managing that diversity.
And the number of teams is constant.
Yes. Yeah. These subpopulations you sort of said we're going to have 6 Ds. Now, because of this like migration stuff, then gradually more and more teams will be in the same area in the fitness landscape. But the way you manage them in the computer, they're still on their own geographic island. It's kind of like, again, think metapopulations. If I've got physically separated islands and wings evolve over there, and everybody else has got legs, then gradually you see wings start spreading to the different islands, and now suddenly everybody's got wings. So they're still all separated, but now they all have wings. Yeah.
So how is this different from PSO? Like, both of them have the island-based models. So how is that different?
The PSO?
Yeah.
Well, we haven't gotten this. So PSO will happen in unit 6. And this also in parallel tempering, which we're going to get into in the next unit, this idea that you have these kind of migratory couplings is one of those I mentioned at the top of the lecture that we're going to see these kind of archetypes that show up. And you definitely see hints of that, like the people who built PSO, they were responding to aspects of the GA that the GA, parts of the GA were working for them, but other parts for their application spaces weren't. And so they kept the good parts and they, built out, different parts. And so there's definitely going to be conceptual overlap in a lot of these algorithms. Yeah.
Is this same as ensemble?
Again, you can certainly draw overlaps in dynamics, but I think that it becomes a little forced. We're not really necessarily useful to sort of think about those overlaps here. For one, I wouldn't call this necessarily a learning task. Well, it is a little bit of a learning task, but it's a forced. Whenever you make those analogies, we have to think of all models are useful, but all models are wrong, but some are useful. And so why does, what makes a model useful? It has it illuminated. And so I think you probably could, model this using that sort of model, but then you have to ask myself what new, if it's a microscope and I've now focused on a different, focal depth or whatever like that, what new thing am I seeing? And so I think you can make those analogies, but I don't know if you gain anything new from doing that. All right, so that's shifting balance theory, the basic idea. Once you sort of understand that rough idea, also it's kind of flawed, hasn't been that useful in biology, and ultimately I don't think that's actually what's going on. I don't think people think that's what's going on in DGAs. All right, so why, I've already kind of covered this. Why doesn't SBT seem to work in practice? If the drift is so high that you can cross adaptive valleys, then there's almost no selective pressure left to actually end up climbing any peaks. The drift ends up being this sort of, it's like a bulldozer that just levels all of these fitness peaks, so then everything becomes flat. So it's like, if you imagine you've got a fitness peak here and another fitness peak here, in order for SPT to work, then you might need your effective population size to create an insensitivity that's like this big in order to really reach down into that valley. And at that point, it's like you've basically taken this dynamic fitness landscape and turned it into something that looks more like this. It's like you've just smoothed things over. And if it gets so bad that your fitness landscape ends up looking relatively flat, in which case movement becomes dominated entirely by drift. It just becomes a random walk. So you need selection in order for GAs not to just be random walks. But if SPT is dominated by drift, then if drift is really high, then you just lose the selection, so you lose any difference between it and a random. And so that's one reason that this dependence on drift is a little sus. On top of that, migration rate. This is a Goldilocks issue. If it's too low, then new individuals will not beat local drift. So you're in a population, you're a very drifty population, so selection's like it's got like Vaseline covered eyes. Like it just cannot see, it does not have any acuity at all. And then suddenly one tiny individual with a great adaptation comes over and joins your population. But selection can't even tell that anyone new has gotten there because its vision is so blurry. And so if only one individual comes over, then even though that one individual has really high selection, if the drift that's on there makes it very likely that that one individual doesn't survive. So in order to beat this high drift, you need significant amounts of migration. But if you go too far and have too much migration, then you destroy your population structure and then everybody is just working together. So there's this Goldilocks zone that I think is problem dependent as well. So that's sort of a little bit odd there too. So SPT provides this nice intuition pump for thinking about the four forces of evolution, but I think it's just unlikely to be that useful in thinking about distributed GAs. So what do people do think about distributed GAs? Well, this gets to the kind of particle swarm idea, which we'll talk about particle swarms in the unit after next. But really what's going on in DGAs is parallel multi-start with communication and niching in order to maintain diversity across the large population. What do I mean by that? So really these distributed GAs, these teams, are parallel search teams that are moving around, sharing findings while maintaining these discrete search approaches as long as possible. So again, more similar to swarm intelligence, where this little island is kind of searching in its own space, this little island is searching in its own space. So the individuals on the island drive the diversity in the movements of the island as an individual. Very similar to an individual in a particle swarm that it's flying around. But that individual in a particle swarm, again, we haven't introduced this topic, but just so we brought up, I was mentioning that basic idea. If you've got a particle that's flying in one direction, but it can feel a weak tug from another particle over there flying a different direction, then it might do a course correction. And that's sort of the idea that's coming on here with these distributed GAs. They're really just doing parallel searches with kind of a global coupling. And so the hyperparameters in the DGA that you see, like if you go in, I've shared several Python libraries that do distributed GAs online, so in the module, and you'll see that they all have these three sets of hyperparameters. Mutation rate, how often you mutate, migration rate, migration policy, who you export, and what you do with the imports. And then this is what I haven't talked about yet, migration topology. And this also comes to the swarm intelligence idea, who's talking to who. So not only do you have a population structure where you have island, 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 but you in these GAs say who migrates to who. So you're going to say island A shares with B, B shares with C, C shares with D, D shares with A, ring topology. So, and that is going to set up a certain set of dynamics. You could have a fully connected topology. That will set a certain set of dynamics. Now, or other sparse connection graphs instead of fully connected. the reason you have these hyperparameters goes back to where we started in this little lecture set here, diversity preservation. So DGAs have a slightly different genetic architecture, all the same problems that any genetic algorithm have. Diversity preservation. Genetic algorithms purge diversity over time, even though it is a valuable resource. So to the question earlier, you have to start out with a diverse population. If you don't have that asset, the GA just stops. It doesn't do anything. So you have to maintain diversity as long as possible to keep the engine of the GA running. And the distributed genetic algorithm just gives you more levers, more degrees of freedom to be able to manage that diversity. Spread the population structure out, and then you adjust how often they communicate. And again, this looks very much more like something you see in swarm intelligence. And this will have a natural connection to EVCAs, where we're going to learn about cellular automata. And those cellular automata, they're all about spatial structure. And you can load up genetic algorithms inside a cellular automaton. And that basically says we're going to run a GA, but we're only going to talk to individuals that are in certain neighborhoods, but everybody has a different neighborhood. And so this DGA will overlap with a lot of the work in EVCAs, where again, people have realized that if you can adjust how the population talks to other parts of the population, you can better manage diversity. And that is the key thing you have to manage in order to make any evolutionary algorithm work. So true DGA support, if you look up DEEP or PyGMO, PIGMO, these are ones where you'll find all of these parameters and you can set up these islands and so on. Now, most so-called distributed GAs are actually just parallel GAs. So any GA, whether it be a distributed GA or monolithic GA, has opportunities to parallelize computations. And so especially now, if your fitness function is a black box simulator, if you like set up initial conditions of where robots are and then you let the sim go, and there's all sorts of weird contingent things that can happen during the sim, like sometimes the robots bump into each other, sometimes they don't, then in that case, really those fitness calculations, you need to have separate CPUs for each one of those if you want to parallelize them. But if your fitness is just a function that it's always calculated in exactly the same way, then GPUs work really well for GAs. Because you can just load in, you have 1,000 cores, and you say, I want these 1,000 cores all to run this fitness function, but I'm going to start them with 1,000 initial conditions, and they will crank out 1,000 fitnesses rapidly. But that can be done with a monolithic GA, that can be done with a DGA. So when we talk about distributed GAs, they're not necessarily parallel. And if we talk about parallel GAs, they're not necessarily distributed in the population sense. So they're related, and distributed GAs suggest ways you can parallelize. You can put islands on different processors. That's totally fine to do, but it's not necessary. So the DGAs and PGAs, these are just one's how you implement, the other is how you structure. And that's all we've got on that. So questions about that? That's the end of our GA units. No more genetic algorithms until maybe EVCAs. The very last unit. Okay. All right, so make that pivot now. So we go from nature, well, it's all nature. We go from biology to physics. So this is sort of how we're going to structure this. One of the big things that's going to come out of this Unit 5 is understanding simulated annealing and this sort of newer and more efficient approach, parallel tempering. But that's going to give us the opportunity to stop at lots of things. So we're going to talk about MaxEnt methods in natural language processing and also species distribution modeling. We're going to talk about Monte Carlo sampling. We're going to talk about MCMC and then sort of, again, we're going to come back to things that make MCMC even better than that. And there'll be softmax in here as well. So we'll find out where the temperature comes from in softmax. That also comes out of all of this stuff here. So simulated annealing. Let's introduce this idea. This is a different optimization metaheuristic. And this parallel tempering is like the DGA of simulated annealing. So this will be kind of the very last thing we talk about, similar to how DGAs were the last thing we talked about in that last unit. Simulated annealing has no population structure. This is an individual searcher, and simulated annealing tells that individual searcher where to move. And so it's going to be very different than the population-based methods that we've been looking at. But it's still a very effective method. So simulated annealing, SA, is a very successful optimization metaheuristic. There is a variant of simulated annealing, QUBO. So mention that here. So QUBO, quadratic unconstrained binary optimization, that's not specific to simulated annealing. This is a particular type of optimization problem. And if you can frame your optimization problem as a QUBO, and I'll describe what a QUBO is here in a second, then you can implement an annealer in hardware in both quantum annealers as well as neuromorphic annealers. So there are these two industry leaders here in this. So that, D-Wave. So a lot of people say, D-Wave systems, quantum annealing isn't real quantum computing. But then other people also say that real quantum computing isn't marketable. So it's like a weird thing where I kind of have a hard time sleeping at night if I say that D-Wave sells a quantum computer, because it's not really a quantum computer. But on the other hand, the quantum computing crap that's coming out of Amazon and Google and all that is useless, especially now that we're post-quantum cryptography. So it's just a lost leader for them to sell other crap. So it's like, yeah, D-Wave's not quantum, but who actually wants quantum? That's the question. So, but the point here is that once you learn on simulated annealing, you'll know how to use a D-Wave quantum annealer. And once you learn about simulated annealing, there's also this other approach where we'll talk about neuromorphics when we get to Unit 7. But Intel has a hardware spiking neural network framework, LOIHI, and LOIHI 2, and they have, and as you'll see here in a second, this QUBO, which I will describe, there is tape here, is natural to implement as a spiking neural network. And so it turns out that any optimization problem you can format as a QUBO can be built with LOIHI as a hardware annealer. And both of these hardware annealers, this quantum annealer and actually the neuromorphic seems like it's maybe even better performing than the quantum, allow you for very rapid optimizers that are built in hardware. So they're hardware specific optimizers. So it's kind of cool. You can build a hardware optimizer. All right, so what do I mean by QUBO? So imagine an engineering design problem that takes this form. So the form here is we're minimizing this quadratic. So that's just the fancy kind of linear algebra way to write this thing here. So we've got a decision, some decision variables. So in decision variables that are all binary. That's the B in QUBO. So they only take 0 and 1. So these will be discrete problems. And we're minimizing this quadratic where every problem is a different encoding of the weights on each one of these pairings up here. So you're just, and it turns out that there's a bunch of problems: traveling salesman, graph coloring, max cut, portfolio optimization, scheduling problems. All of these discrete combinatorial optimization problems you can write as a QUBO. So if you want to solve a really big traveling salesman problem, something that is like United States scale traveling salesman problem, with all the cities or whatever, something that would be a very time consuming process. You can encode that problem as a Q matrix here and turn it into a QUBO and then load it onto a quantum annealer or one of these neuromorphic annealers. And it will solve your QUBO problem using simulated annealing, or using real annealing, but simulated annealing that we're going to learn. And how does that loading work? Well, if you look at this formula here, if you imagine that X's are inputs and the E is an output, this is just a recurrent neural network. For those where that doesn't make sense yet, we will introduce all of this in Unit 7. This is just kind of aside for those that are interested in this topic. But a QUBO optimization objective you can implement as a recurrent neural network. And any recurrent neural network you can implement on hardware using Luigi, and then Luigi can actually solve this problem. Likewise, if you're familiar with an Ising model, so an Ising model, these models in physics where you've got these two spin states up and down, and as these magnetic spin states are flipping, they're influencing the spin states of things around them. And what quantum annealers do is they allow you to tune the magnetic coupling between qubits that spin up and down. And so it turns out that the Hamiltonian of that Ising model is also phrased as exactly a QUBO. So anything you can write as a QUBO, you can build an Ising model that once it settles down, so once all those bits stop, so it's kind of like you set the temperature of a material and you wait to see like what the states are at equilibrium. That equilibrium state will be the solution to your traveling salesman. And so these things make it extremely convenient to embed these combinatorial optimization problems in these hardware. So, and they're just using annealing behind the scenes. So we have to talk about what annealing is, and that's what we're doing, but this is just a motivation. Yeah.
Is the QINJ is like a weight matrix of all the layers, and XINJ are like current and past input vectors?
They're like, well, they're not hidden layers, but these are inputs. So, so you can imagine there was just a single layer. So we've got, we've got a giant input coming in, and we're just doing a fully connected network of all the inputs to form an output. And that is what this is here.
So XJ is the previous output vector, like since RNN.
It's not previous. So the input has got an I component and a J component. But you can also have self loops. That's why it's recurrent. So the diagonal terms of the Q matrix is what makes it recurrent. Yeah.
So it's like the recurrent neural network, the one infinity morphic, and then the other one might be quantum, or is it just?
So you can view like an operation, like if we have industrial engineers in the crowd, they should look at this and not see neural networks or neuromorphics or whatever. An industrial engineer looks at this and sees an optimization, sees an urban OR problem. And so, so as people that are problem focused, they just look at this and say, well, that's a mathematical model of a problem I have to solve. But a computer scientist looks at this and they don't know about problems, but they know about solutions. And so they look at this and they say, that formula, I know lots of cool ways to implement that formula. And so I'm going to implement that formula as a neural network. And these are the weights of my neural network. These are the inputs of my neural network. These are the outputs. And so you can either implement it as a neural network, in which case you can use Loihi to solve it. Or you can implement it as these magnetic couplings between qubits, which that's what, so you need to sparsify. So this might be one of these things where I can say, well, we'll talk about offline, but like if you have 100 variables, right now, the D-wave simulated annealer, or the D-wave annealer, only allows for a qubit to talk to like 15 other qubits. So if you've got 100 qubits that need to talk to each other, you may need to create 500 qubits to sparsify this matrix so that no individual talks to more than 15 other individuals. So you can implement your 100 by 100 interactions with a sparse 500 by 500 interaction. As long as you've got a quantum annealer that can do these things, then you can implement that. And by the way, so this is just my aside. We actually now have a course in quantum computing. Aviral teaches it. I think this upcoming fall. I think it's CSE 533. And he does talk about QUBO, quantum annealing. I think it's towards the end of his agenda. So I'm just mentioning this because I'm trying to justify, like, why are we talking about simulated annealing? I thought that died in the 80s or something. And I'm like, well, it's still used. And when we get to parallel tempering, classical parallel tempering that you implement on those computers are used as benchmarks for hardware annealing. And there is a quest to build a hardware parallel temperer, which they think will be even faster than the annealers. So all this stuff is relevant and new, it's just gonna feel a little old, but I promise you there are modern applications. So if you're interested in more of this quantum stuff, check out 533, which I think is offered in the fall. Yeah.
How do you incorporate the constraints, like if there are Lagrangian terms ahead of this, right?
Yeah, so that's where, so QUBO, the U is unconstrained. So, and the OR people have tricks for this. And so you can turn hard constraints into soft constraints. So you can say like, I don't ever want these numbers to add up to anything, to add to more than 6, or they have to equal exactly 6. Well, instead, you can encode in this Q matrix a penalty that says if you're anything other than 6, the penalty is really, really high. And so it's a soft constraint. So technically, you're saying it's feasible for these variables to add up to something other than 6. But if you can manage to find a solution where they add up to 6, that should have significantly lower energy. So there are methods to encode hard constraints as weights in here. They just augment your the rows of this Q matrix in order to incorporate those. So I mean, a lot of that is like, especially for hardware, we want to take an energetic perspective because it's hard enough, as you guys now I think have started to see if you've built your mini projects, it's hard to maintain feasibility in these things. If I give you a very complicated constraint, an expression of the feasible set. A feasible set looks like a funny shape and it's a star shape or whatever. It's really hard to say, oh shoot, I generated something outside of that. How do I get it back in? And if you just keep randomly drawing, it takes forever to get something feasible again. And so if you're talking these hardware annealers, they're really dumb. There's not a lot of logic going on. They are just physical engines that are relaxing into a cool state. That's what we're going to talk about. That's the point of this unit, is to understand what I just said. And so because they're so dumb, we need to give them a problem that is relatively easy, and that means an approximate problem. So rather than enforcing these hard constraints that we need logic in order to understand, you got to strip all that logic out, give them an approximation with their soft constraints instead.
Because sorry if this is a bit divergent, but like if you have global constraints, right, it becomes really hard to put them as local constraints, and that's where big.
Yeah, I mean, it's that. Yes, I mean, I'm sort of saying that this is easy, or suggesting, but that there are challenges to shoehorning. I mean, so there are a set of problems here that fit really well into this, but these problems are sort of like the problems I've listed here naturally fit into this without having to worry so much about constraints. So not every problem is going to easily fit into here. But if you do have constraints, a few of them, there are ways to make it work. But if it doesn't encode cleanly into here as a sparse matrix or a matrix that could be made sparse, then maybe just do it in software and not in hardware. Okay, so that's our motivation here. So we're going to focus for now on a general single objective optimization, continuous or discrete, not a QUBO problem, whatever. I just brought this up to sort of say that if you know how to do simulated annealing, there are optimization problems where you can take the same annealer that you implement in software and download it to hardware and it'll run super fast because it's on hardware. Okay, so we need a couple set of preliminaries for us to talk about all of this physics-inspired stuff. The same way I started the evolutionary unit, talking about genes and genotypes and phenotypes, we need the same content grammar here. So this will be a little definitional, but we have to kind of get through it. So we're going to refer to a physical object or a system as a macrostate. So, or the constraints, I should say, that define the object. So this chair, I probably wouldn't say this chair is a macrostate, but when you look at that, you know it's a chair. You know that over there is a chair, you know that this is a chair. I'd say, how do you know it's a chair? You'd say, well, it shapes like a chair. What do you mean by shape like, and it's got all the right properties of a chair. It's hard like a chair. It's got all these things. Those are constraints. Those are informational constraints, but also physical constraints. Those set of constraints is what we call a macrostate. So this chair abides by that macrostate, all of those constraints, and that's why we can call it chair. This abides by the macrostate to a table. So this is a table macrostate, this is a chair macrostate, this is a TED macrostate. So the chair is defined by shape and its physical properties. Now this chair has got a lot of stuff in it, right? So it's made of particles, it's made of molecules that have position and momentum. So a microstate is one configuration that meets the constraints of the macrostate. So the point I'm trying to get here is that there are many different microstates that we still would call a chair. So we would refer to a macrostate as having multiple realizability or degeneracy. So there's one chair, but there are, 10 to the 25 different microstates that could be this chair. So, like this chair is sitting here and all of the molecules in this chair are in a particular configuration, but they're jiggling a little bit. So a second later, they jiggle, and you can't see this, but the lattice that's making up the molecules of this chair have moved a little bit. It's still a chair though. So now one molecule is moving a little faster than another, but it trades that energy with other molecules in the lattice that makes it this chair. And so now there's different momentum. It's still a chair, but the microstates are changing. There's lots of different microstates. There's a distribution of microstates that we associated with this one macrostate chair. Okay, that makes sense. Yep.
So if you had an office chair, would that be a new macrostate or a different microstate?
Yeah, whenever, and there is a tight link between information and physics. Whenever you add information, you say, no, I'm not looking for any chair, I'm looking for an office chair. That is a new macrostate. So anytime you add a constraint, you change the shape of the thing that you recognize in space, then we can call that a new macrostate. Okay. Before I trip over this macrostate. Okay, so microstates in the same macrostate can have different energies. So that chair is sitting there, it's thermally agitated. There's a microstate right now. This chair, I should have left it here. It's gonna leave it out here. All right, so this chair has got a certain microstate right now at this instant. Now, at this instant, it's in a different microstate. That microstate might have a slightly higher energy. So it might have been bombarded, for example. So the air in this room is bombarding the chair, and it just warmed it up a little. And so now there's a little bit more energy in the chair. But then now there's a little less energy in the chair. So it's going through fluctuations of different energy states as well. And those, we can label each microstate with a certain energy. So different microstates have different energies. These affect the probability of the system being in them. If you could graph the microstates that this chair could be in, the ones that have high energy will happen, but they probably don't happen very often. The ones that have low energy will happen, and they probably are the most likely cases, microstates that this chair is in at the time. We can't observe the microstates. We can infer by their distribution how likely the microstates are if we know the energies associated with each microstate. So computationally, if you give me a description of all of the molecules in this chair, I could plug that into a computational solver and calculate the energy of that microstate. And I can calculate the energy of another microstate. So I could build from the bottom up a list of microstate to energy mappings. And that should feel like fitness to you. I could theoretically, in a genetic algorithm, have a system with lots of decision variables, and I could run it into a fitness function, a simulation. And then out of it would come a fitness evaluation, a single number. And that is going to be analogous to the energy of a microstate. And our microstates will be analogous to our decision variables in the genetic algorithms. So microstates can have different energies. Energies affect how probable things are. All right, so that's the chair. What about what's around the chair? So we say that a system is in contact with a heat bath. And that's the last time I'll probably use that term. So, but it's the standard term here. But the point of the heat path is it fixes the temperature around the chair. So I'm considering classical mechanics, nothing quantum, near equilibrium, quasi-equilibrium. Physicists hate it when you say this chair is in equilibrium, because to a physicist, the only thing that's equilibrium is the heat depth of the universe. And so none of this room is in equilibrium. We are all marching toward, and this is a topic that we will cover later in this unit, but we all are marching toward eventually just being still, lifeless, heatless objects or states of the universe. And so technically this chair will not be here forever. It's quasi-equilibrium. But for the purpose, but you know, that's science, you know, whatever they say, science is the captain and you know, practice, the soldiers or whatever. We're engineers or computer scientists, which aren't real scientists, but you know, and so we're more interested in practice. And so in practice, this is an equilibrium. So at equilibrium, it's got a temperature around it. What do we mean by temperature? Temperature is the average thermal activity in the system. And that is being imparted to it by the room around it. So the chair is sitting at a particular temperature, and that temperature is, you know, you can think of it as little molecules that are bumping into the chair, and they are animating the microstates of the chair. They're giving it thermal activity. And the higher the temperature, the more thermal activity they're regulating into the chair, the lower the less. So temperature is the average thermal activity. You can think of it as how fast do particles, molecules move on average. This is an additional constraint on the system. So there's all of the constraints that correspond to the macrostate of what it means to be a chair, plus a constraint that the chair is being held at a particular temperature by the heat bath. Okay, 2 times I used that term. All right. Questions about that so far? So now we need to connect temperature with energy. All right, so what temperature does is it sets up the characteristic scale of energy fluctuations in the chair. And so the energy, I'm going to call it here, and I say this with a little hesitation because budget implies a deterministicness that, you know, a hard cutoff, when it's not a hard cutoff. That's why it's better to say scale. But temperature sets up the scale of energetic fluctuations among microstates in the chair. And so physicists have this proportionality constant called Boltzmann's constant, or sometimes the Boltzmann constant, sometimes Boltzmann's constant, KB. When we get into simulated annealing, a lot of times our algorithms just set it equal to 1 and drop it. But just to sort of get our intuition correct, this is what maps the temperature of the room to the microstates that will be accessible to each other in the chair. And so that's when you turn up the temperature, you're providing a bigger budget for moving from one low energy microstate to a higher energy microstate. And we're going to see this in a graph. All right, so microstates transitions here, this is what I was just saying in words, is that if you're at a microstate and you want to go to another microstate, if that transition requires, if it's a downward transition, you can always take it. But if it is a transition that happened, that the change in energy is less than this energy budget set by temperature, it happens very often. If it's greater than this energy budget, then it's far less likely. So that's what gives you the ability to move around the microstate, to move around your different decision variables, is this energy budget that is set up by temperature. So if we're mapping this to engineering design optimization, then the The macrostate encodes our problem. It encodes our system. The microstate are our decision variables, the degrees of freedom we have to implement a solution to act on that system, that problem. And the temperature stuff are the solver dynamics. So how are we going to search through all the possible solutions to our problem? There's one problem, there's one chair. There's different ways to build a chair. Those are the microstates. How do we search through all the different microstates to find the lowest energy one? That is what we use temperature for. And so if we want to draw that out, then here is a diagram here of an energetic landscape. I've got my microstates across the x-axis. I've got each microstate has got a different energy. And so if I start at an initial microstate here, then the difference, it's in a little well. In order for it to have enough thermal agitation to get out of that well, then it needs enough temperature. It needs enough of an energy budget to go up over the edges. Well, that's my delta E. That's how much energy I need to get up over this to try to go into this well here, this basin over here. Well, the temperature is what tells me, do you have enough energy to make that jump? So if you're at a very high temperature, you'll make that jump red, you'll make it all the time. You very frequently go from this well into this well. But if you have a very low temperature, you might be stuck in this candidate here. And so when we talk about simulated annealing, that's sort of, and this we'll pick up next time, but let me show you I'll show you a little animation and then we'll pick up here next time. So these are all things I just built over the weekend because I thought they'd be helpful. But here is a little energetic landscape that is similar to what I just drew. Here is the global minimum. Here's where we start. If I start at a high temperature, then I've got my microstate is jumping to lots of other microstates, and it's having a hard time getting over this, but eventually it will jump over that so long as it's high temperature. Problem is, that high temperature also allows it to climb out of the global min. So if I put it at a high temperature, I will probably find the global min sometimes, but I will often jump out of it. Now, if I instead was at a medium temperature, then maybe I have a nice balance where I do exploration and I will slowly but eventually get into this global min. But then once I'm there, maybe I stay there, but I might still have enough energy to climb this thing. If I instead go to a low temperature here, then I get stuck in this well here. So ideally what I would like to do is set up an annealing schedule, which you can see down here. I start at a high temperature and I slowly cool to a low temperature. And if I do this schedule, let's say slow enough, then I will have enough time to explore the system. And if I gradually slowly cool, and if I'm lucky, maybe I catch the microstate in the low well, in this near this global minimum well here. And by that time, the temperature will get low enough that it won't have enough energy to come back out of the well. And I will just come and settle on the global minimum. That's simulated annealing in a nutshell. So we have to learn how to build those dynamics to work like they do in the physics. All right, I don't want to keep you any longer, so we'll stop there. Feel free to come up if you have questions, and we'll pick up here on Tuesday. So have a nice week.